Good evening. We'll be getting started in just 1 minute as we wait for people to arrive. Okay, well, we can get started. We are live on YouTube and on Zoom. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Mark Memagonian. I am the Director of Academic Affairs at the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, and I have just a few words to share with you before we get on with our program. I want to thank you all for joining us, and I especially want to thank our co-sponsor for this event and the organizer of the program, the Armenian Center at Columbia University, and in particular, Dr. Khachig Muradian, who you will be hearing from shortly. This is part of our ongoing series of events in collaboration with the Armenian Center at Columbia, and we're very happy to be partnering with them on high-quality programs. This evening is also the last program of this very strange year of 2020 for NASR. And I want to thank everybody who has been along for all of these programs, or for many of these programs that we've been doing, and who have learned the ropes of webinars and Zoom and virtual programs as we have learned the ropes. And we truly appreciate the level of interest that's been shown in the programs this year, and we are planning more for 2021. And I hope, of course, that 2021 will be a better year in every respect than 2020, but we will be continuing on with our programs. So thank you so much, and I will disappear and hand things over to Dr. Khachig Muradian to introduce tonight's program. Khachig.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for the introduction. This is the last event of the year for the Columbia University Armenian Center as well. Our year started, our weekly events started in person, in January, February of this year. And the pandemic and then the war in Nagorno-Karabakh essentially appended the schedule. Initially, we had to cancel a number of events that we were holding past March 5th. And then we had a delayed start this semester as the war was raging in Artsakh. This is another and a great opportunity for me to once again thank NASR, our partner in all the events that we have held at Columbia University. These were weekly in-person events before the pandemic, and over the past couple of months, these weekly events were online, and NASR has always been a co-sponsor and helped with organizing and every aspect of these events. I would like to also thank some of our other partners during this year. They include the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies, my department, the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University, which has co-sponsored a significant number of events this year with us, the Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia, the programs in global health at Vagelos College of Physicians and Surgeons at Columbia University, the Research Institute on Turkey. On a number of occasions, we also co-sponsored events within the framework of the NASR Kalust Gulbenkian Foundation series on contemporary Armenian issues. And a number of events were also co-sponsored by the Columbia University Armenian Society. So this has been a year of, as Mark mentioned, tremendous changes, transformations, and experiences that we would like to leave behind as we move forward into next year. And we do look forward to our programming, again, jointly with NASA and other partners early next year, and hope you all can join us. Today's speaker is Dr. Arasanjan. He is an associate professor of history at the University of Michigan, Dearborn, and the director of the university's Armenian Research Center. He received his master's degree in history from Yerevan State University in 1991 and his PhD from the University of London in 1996. From 1996 to 2005, he taught at Vazgen University in Beirut. And this is the time when I, as an undergraduate student, saw in Dr. Sanjan a mentor and a professor. And it was the beginning of a friendship of many years. He was the Henry S. Khanzadian Kazan Visiting Professor in Armenian Studies at California State University, Fresno in 2003. His research interests focus on the post-World War I history of Armenia, Turkey, and the Arab states of Western Asia. Today's lecture focuses on the Armenian Church in Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh in modern times. The event is going to be structured in the following way. The first 45 minutes is going to be the lecture, followed by a Q&A discussion session with Dr. Sanjan. Please post your questions in the comment section or the Q&A section, and we will try to get to them after the lecture. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Arasanjan to deliver his remarks.
Good evening. Since I have a lot to say, so I'll straight to go into the topic. I think my screen sharing has to come. All right. So let me just define the geography and also the subject of the talk. We're going to talk about the Armenian Church as an institution. It is an institution. And today we estimate that around 85 to 90% of all Armenians across the world are nominally members of this church. And to some extent, it is the Armenian National Church, although as we know, there are also Catholic and evangelical or Protestant Armenians as well, who are also accepted to be part of the Armenian nation as well. Now, in recent years, the two terms Nagorno or mountainous or Lernain Karabakh and Artsakh are being used interchangeably, although technically they are a bit different. So I will just clarify these terms, and I'll be concentrating on the term Nagorno-Karabakh for reasons that you will see. Artsakh essentially was one of the 15 traditional provinces of historic Armenia. We know about it from an Armenian medieval geography written sometime between the 5th and the 7th centuries. Modern scholars estimate that it had an area of around 11,500 square kilometers, equivalent to almost 4,500 square miles, much bigger than Nagorno-Karabakh that I will use. And then, of course, some people say that although Armenian literature begins in the 5th century, there are toponyms, names of places mentioned in the Urartian inscriptions or in Strabo's geography from very early in this millennium, where, of course, which are probably antecedents or precedents, of Artsakh's name. It's a very old place name. Karabakh, of course, is a relatively recent place name. It was used sometime beginning in the 13th or the 14th century. We also have its Armenian equivalent, Sev Aiki, being used as well in Armenian literature from the same period. And Karabakh, of course, is much bigger an area than Nagorno-Karabakh. From the 16th century onwards, it was a province of the Iranian Safavid Empire. and you will see it here. And then later on in the 18th century, for a few decades, it became a khanate. So that is an semi-independent kind of political entity within the empire, self-governing, ruled, of course, by a khan. This was taken over by the Russians in 1806. The Khanate survived for another 15 years or so, and it was abolished in 1822 by the Russians. And from then on, we don't have any kind of a specific administrative unit or subunit called Karabakh, but the region remained part of the Russian Empire until the October Revolution of 1917. Its area is roughly estimated to be around 16,000 square kilometers, or just under 6,500 miles. If we take Karabakh, this large region, under the Savids and the Russians, that is from the 16th century onwards, Muslims constituted the majority of the population in the lowland sections of Karabakh, while Armenians predominated in the highlands, where eventually the smaller entity of Nagorno-Karabakh emerged. It became a separate administrative unit in 1923 and formally continued as part of Azerbaijan, an autonomous region of Azerbaijan, until 1991. Since then, this area has been the core of an independent statehood, which has declared itself independence, enjoys support from Armenia, but is not internationally recognized. This area, which in Soviet times was about 4,400 square kilometers, 1,700 square miles, basically had in 1926, this is the first Soviet census, after the unit was created, had a population of 125,000, of which almost 90% were Armenians and almost 10% were Azerbaijanis. Gradually, during the Soviet years, the percentage of the Azerbaijanis increased, but of course, Armenians remained predominant up until 1988, when the modern phase of the conflict began between Armenians and Azerbaijanis over the control of the area of Nagorno-Karabakh. And since we're talking about the church, we start with Christianity in Armenia. Artsakh was part of Armenia, and so basically the early history of Artsakh is part of the early history of Armenia. And Armenia became a Christian state early in the 4th century through the missionary activities of St. Gregory the Illuminator. It is said that St. Gregory the Illuminator established the Church of Amaras, which is still a functioning church, and it is considered thus to be, the oldest surviving Christian place of worship in Nagorno-Karabakh. Of course, in the 4th century, we didn't have Armenian written literature yet. The information comes from slightly later Armenian sources, but it's recorded very early on in the Middle Ages. When we talk about the history of Artsakh, we also have to talk about the neighboring region of Albania, and you see this on the map. This Albania, as we always say, has nothing to do with the Albania in the Balkans. That's why to distinguish it, we use the term Caucasian Albania. And this as a separate entity, northeast of Armenia, just of course divided by the river Kur, which basically starts from what is now Georgia and then flows in a southeasterly direction to the Caspian Sea. And Albania as a separate political entity is mentioned in the Greek and Roman sources already from just before this millennium, in the 1st and the 2nd centuries BCE. Armenians, of course, called Albania Arvank, and the last letter K has a double meaning in Armenia. It may mean a group of Albanians, or it may mean also the land of Albania. And that's why it's a bit confusing, because we don't know much about the Albanians, and that's why I'll be using the word Arvank, because sometimes we don't know whether we're talking about the land of the territory or we're talking about a very strongly identifiable separate ethnic group. As I said, we don't know what the Albanians call themselves because we don't have a lot of literature written in the Albanian language. We know a little bit about the language, and there is information in the Greco-Roman sources that there may be as much as 27 different tribes or sub-ethnic groups, and we don't know if all of them spoke their one single language, or did they have their dialects, and those dialects were mutually intelligible or not. That, again, we know very little about them. And the way I'm talking about these things will become evident in the coming minutes of this lecture. There was a separate kingdom in Albania, which of course in time came under Persian influence as well, just like Armenia did with the rise of the Parthian and later on the Sasanian empires in Iran. Albania was Christianized around the same time as Armenia. And again, we have early medieval Armenian traditions which say that St. Gregory the Illuminator ordained his grandson to proselytize among the Albanians. He was martyred or killed when carrying out his missionary activity, and later on his relics were interred in Amaras itself. And this is a map of Armenia. You see it in yellow, and Albania, you see it in orange, just before the year 387, when the Persian kings introduced political changes. As I said, both areas were under Persian influence, and then around the year 387, the Sasanian kings detached the provinces of Artsakh and Udik, northwest of Armenia, and attached them to Albania. So instead of being the border between Armenia and Albania, now the Kur River basically started flowing through the middle of the kingdom of Arvank, which of course was under the suzerainty of the Sasanian kings itself. During this period, the Armenian alphabet was invented by Mesrop Mashtots, and again, early tradition says that one of the first schools which Mashtots founded to spread the new alphabet was in Amaras itself. Medieval Armenian sources also say that Mashtots not only invented the Armenian alphabet, but also he created alphabets for Georgian and Albanian. Up until the middle of last century, the only thing we knew about this Albanian was a simple manuscript, which is housed in the Armenian Institute of Ancient Manuscript in Yerevan, the famous Matenadaran. And in this manuscript, we have a list of alphabets. And among those alphabets listed in this manual is the Albanian alphabet. You see that, of course, in the picture where you have the each letter and then under it, its name written in the Armenian language of how that letter's name was pronounced. But up until the 1950s, not a single piece of writing in this language was available. In 1949, in the region of Mingechavir, which is to the east of Nagorno-Karabakh, during excavations, finally a few inscriptions on stone were actually recovered. And more importantly, starting from 1996, a few pieces of writing on parchment basically have also been recovered, this time in the very famous St. Catherine's Monastery in Mount Sinai, which was, of course, one of the large libraries of the Christian East at the time. These manuscripts are what we call palimpsests. That is, they were manuscripts which were originally written in Albanian. Then they basically were deleted, and over them other texts were written, mostly in Georgian. We have only a handful of pages of these, but through modern technology, we can read what was written underneath and then rubbed out. And unfortunately, what we have are only religious texts, parts of the Bible and some other religious texts. So they don't add anything to our knowledge of the history of the Albanians, but basically they give us some idea. And today we think that Albanian was part of the Caucasian group of languages, probably closer to Georgian than, of course, to Armenian, which is an Indo-European language. During the period when this kingdom of Arvank continued its semi-autonomous existence under the Sasanians, also a separate Catholicosate of Albanians or Albania Arvank emerged in the year 552. Its jurisdiction basically also extended over Artsakh and Udik, which by then had been part of the kingdom of Albania for some time. When the Christological differences over the decision of Council of Chalcedon emerged in the 5th century, eventually Armenians and the Albanians went one way, and basically the Albanian church became something like a junior part of the Armenian church in rejecting the Chalcedonian doctrine, while eventually the Georgians became Chalcedonians. And thereafter, up until this Catholicosate basically was abolished by the Russians, as we'll see, many centuries later. The Catholicos of Artsakh accepted the primacy of honor of the Catholic of all Armenians. At many times they were ordained by the Catholic of Armenians. They had their differences, but never on doctrinal issues. And the Albanian church remained a pre-Chalcedonian church, like the Armenian church was or has been throughout its history. The line of kings in Artsakh ended with the Arab conquests, but actually the Catholicosate continued, and more it came to resemble as a regional Catholicosate within the Armenian church. And many of you know that we had up to a few of them, during Armenian history, and even today there are two Catholicosates which still exist. One of them, at least spiritually, is considered to be superior, and it's based in Echmiadzin now, and of course its head is called the Catholicos of all Armenians. The Catholicosate of Artsakh was also in a similar situation vis-a-vis the Catholicos of all Armenians throughout its history. From the 14th century, its headquarters were based in the very famous monastery of Kanzasar, which up till now is a functioning Armenian church as well. The administrative boundaries of the Catholicosate of Artsakh have changed over the years because of the political upheavals. And finally, in the early 19th century, the Russians conquered the region from the Persians. And because they considered Echmiadzin to be the center of all Armenian subjects within the Russian Empire, they practically abolished the Catholicosate of Kanzasar in 1815. That Catholicosate turned into a metropolitan seat and then to a simple diocese of the Armenian church under the jurisdiction of Echmiadzin. In the mid-19th century, it encompassed the three towns of Shushi, Nuhi, and Lenkoran. Shushi is within Nagorno-Karabakh, Nuhi and Lenkoran are to the east of Nagorno-Karabakh, and some 156 other villages. Records from the early 20th century, they say that the diocese basically had within its own territories about 225 settlements and villages with 215 churches and an estimated 190,000 Armenian parishioners. And of course, these are modern times and these are relatively reliable numbers, probably, of course, collected to the orders of the church by the various parishes across the area. In the 19th century, under the Russians, Shushi became a very thriving town. It was the largest town in the area, one of the largest towns within the Transcaucasus, even larger than Yerevan and what is now Gyumri or Alexandropol for some time. And at that time, it was a thriving town where both Azerbaijanis and Armenians lived. And of course, the Gazan-Chetsot Cathedral, which is so symbolic of Shushi, at least for Armenians in Shushi, was built at the time in the second half of the 19th century. At that time, it was the largest Armenian church in the world. And today, I think it is the second largest, only second to the new Yerevan Cathedral, which was built a few decades back, just after Armenia became independent. Now, then the Russian Empire collapsed. There were a few years of turmoil. Independent Armenia and Azerbaijan emerged. They disagreed with one another over borders. And in this period of turmoil, there were massacres, forced ethnic cleansing, etc. Until basically in 1921, the Bolsheviks came from Russia, imposed their rule on Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. And as a part of solving the territorial disputes, they imposed the compromise whereby the mountainous areas of Karabakh were detached from the rest of Karabakh. They became the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Region, and that region, of course, became part of Soviet Azerbaijan, something which, of course, the Armenians never liked, and has always been a source of problems ever since between them. Prior to the Soviets coming to the area, during the period of Armenian and Azerbaijani clashes, Shushi had witnessed a massacre whereby in that particular location, the Azerbaijanis had massacred a few thousand Armenians. Among those killed was the prelate of Shushi himself, and Armenian quarters were destroyed. And eventually, this was the beginning of the downturn of the city, and yet it has never recovered ever since this period, if in 1916 Shushi had a population of about 44,000, of which something like 22,000 were Armenians and about 18,000 or slightly more were Azerbaijanis, the total population of the city had come down to 5,100 10 years later, at the time of the first Soviet census. So not only the massacred Armenians had left, but also many of the Azerbaijanis had left in what was now gradually becoming a very second-rate town. And because of this, when Nagorno-Karabakh was established, it had a predominantly Armenian population, while Shushi had a predominantly Azerbaijani population. Therefore, Shushi was not made the capital of Nagorno-Karabakh, which it should have been under normal circumstances. But next to Shushi, a small village called Khankendi, and prior to that Varagan, with a population of about 1,500 people at that time, became the center of Karabakh. It was renamed and was called Stepanakert after the Bolshevik Armenian leader Stepan Shahumyan. And of course, from that moment on, Stepanakert has far outgrown Shushi. And just before the war, a few weeks ago, it had a population of close to 50,000 people. While, for example, at its height, Shushi had a population about 14,000 or so in the year 1988. So just to compare how much the fate of these two cities, while just a few miles away from one another, has changed over these years. Now we're coming straight to our own topic of how did the church fare in Nagorno-Karabakh. And of course, the fate of the church was not different from fate of all other religions in the Soviet Union. The Soviets were anti-religious, and they waged a very anti-religious campaign against the Armenian church in Nagorno-Karabakh as well. Basically, their zealous representatives, whether they were the political police, local village authorities, or members of the Communist Party, confiscated church ornaments and buildings, turned those buildings into theaters, clubs, workshops, warehouses, and storage spaces. They imposed special taxes on the priests, purposefully mocked them in public, deprived them of their fair share when farmland was distributed among the villagers, so that they will be in a very difficult situation to be able to survive. And many priests were forced to renounce their calling. They were even forced to make statements about that in the press to be an example for the others. So this is, of course, targeting churches and priests at the local level. The Bolsheviks also tried to undermine the diocesan structures to make it possible for the churches to function as a part of a special system, and also to bring their links with the headquarters of the Armenian Church in Soviet Armenia in Echmiadzin. It is estimated that Nagorno-Karabakh was created. There were 162 Armenian villages in that area, and they had 136 churches. Less than a decade later, only 27 of these churches were functioning. So down from, let's say, 136 in 1923 to 27 in 1929, and this was not the end of the matter. Among those churches that were closed very early on was the Church of St. George in Stepanakert, which was expropriated, turned into a storage, then demolished in the 1930s, and then in the 1950s, the Stepanakert Drama Theater was built. And even today, of course, the Drama Theater building is still there. At the same time, when the churches were closed, inevitably the number of the priests also declined. In 1923, there were 88 married priests functioning in Karabakh, and by 1929, the numbers were down to 22. After the prelate had been murdered in Shushi in March 1920 during the massacres, for a couple of years, the prelacy was led by locum tenentes, until in 1922, a 70-year-old Archbishop, Anania Hamazaspian, was appointed. He had to resign because he was facing very difficult challenges because of the Bolshevik oppression in 1924. But then there was a call to appoint a new prelate, and this person, Vertanes Hagopian, ended up being the last prelate. He came to Nagorno-Karabakh in 1925, established his seat at the monastery of Gandzasar. They didn't go back to Shushi. But in 1930, he was arrested, kept in jail for almost 2 years, then released, went to Echmiadzin, participated in the Catholic Council elections of 1932. But then when he wanted to go back to Karabakh, he was told that he could never go back. The Armenian church failed to find a new diocese for him to send him as prelate. Harbin in China was tried, but that was rejected as well. And finally, he died in Echmiadzin in 1943, and this is his tomb in one of the churches next to the main cathedral of Echmiadzin. And until 1989, practically there will be no diocese and no prelate in Nagorno-Karabakh. That is from 1933 to 1989. In 1941, at a very important church meeting, it was officially stated that the former diocese of Artsakh and Gandzak, that is the town of Girovabad, which is now called Gyanja, which also was the seat of a separate diocese, they had been abolished and they had joined the diocese of Baku and Turkestan. Although unlike in Karabakh, in Girovabad, there was a functioning church, as there was also in Baku. But of course, there was only from now on one diocese, which encompassed not only Azerbaijan, but also the Trans-Caspian republics of the Soviet Union in what we now call the Central Asia. Armenian language sources which have been written in recent years, they do not say much about what happened with the non-Armenians, that is mostly the Muslims living in Nagorno-Karabakh. And I haven't been able to find much material, but we assume that there was also intense anti-Muslim campaigns as well in Nagorno-Karabakh, targeting the Azerbaijani population, because it was all part of the same policy of, anti-religious and atheism that was going on. A 1938, the 36 Soviet government document says that there had been 161 places of worship that existed in Nagorno-Karabakh before Sovietization, and all of them had been closed. Since 161 is much bigger than the Armenian number, probably these also includes some Muslim mosques and other institutions as well. Now, how did Christianity fare in Karabakh in the absence of a formal diocesan church structure? I will go on studying this further, but as far as I know, the only scholar who has dealt with this issue is Hrant Chilingirian, who years ago wrote a comparative study of Karabakh and Abkhazia. And he actually talks about how Christianity continued to survive one way or another without a formal church structure. He says that the absence of the church and the rural nature of Karabakh made it the Armenians in Karabakh be less resistant to communism than, let's say, in urban areas. And many people took communism as some kind of a collective belief, because people had to believe in something, and to some extent they had to justify their morality through communist teaching as well. Religious beliefs continued, but they were gradually reduced to the private sphere in individual life. Family members learned traditions by observing their elders, and these traditional religious rituals continued to be practiced in secret because they were discouraged by the government as, some kind of an ancient heritage that had to be tossed out. And of course, they underwent amendments and adjustments. And within 2 or 3 generations, because Chilingirian carried out his fieldwork in the mid-1990s, most people could not even explain what they were doing or what was the religious or any other significance of the rituals that they were observing, but they simply did it because their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents had done these things for many generations. People used to conduct local pilgrimages to what they considered to be holy places. Some of them did have religious backgrounds. Others basically were like sacred trees, rocks, and other things, etc. And he talks in detail about them. Most of the new thing that I will add to this lecture, and hopefully this will be published sometime in the near future, is that how the Armenian church itself tried to come back to Karabakh after it was completely kicked out of Karabakh, as I said, by 1933. The nadir of the Armenian church in the Soviet Union was the year 1938. The Catholicos died in mysterious circumstances. It was officially announced that he had died of a heart attack, but there is good reason to believe that he may have actually been strangled. The Armenian communist leadership in Yerevan actually appealed to Moscow to put an end to the institution of the Catholicos state and turn the Cathedral of Echmiadzin into a museum. But Joseph Stalin never answered that request, and it stayed like that. Then comes World War II, and as early as 1940, even before the Soviets entered the war, we see a different attitude towards religion or formal religion, including a new attitude towards the Armenian church, allowing a small existence controlled by the state, but in any case, not attempting to actually wipe out the whole institution. But even as there was slight revival of the Armenian church after 1940, 1941, that ecclesiastical assembly, which I referred to, was part of that effort. Nagorno-Karabakh always remained on the margins, and basically there was very little that Echmiadzin was allowed to do in Nagorno-Karabakh itself because of reasons that I will come. The period after World War II is very significant because not only the church has given some breath of life, but also the Armenian leadership in Yerevan starts becoming bolder. And at least we know that on 3 separate occasions, the Communist Party leader in Armenia in 1945, 1947, and 1949 wrote 3 times letters to Stalin and Molotov asking for Nagorno-Karabakh to be unified with Soviet Armenia. Within this atmosphere, of course, these were done mostly in secret, and people at large did not know much about it outside party and government circles. The head of the Armenian church at that time, Georg VI, also made attempts to relaunch the Armenian diocese in Nagorno-Karabakh, or at least open a church there, because there were no churches there since the early 1930s. And the churches that were considered for possible reopening were the monastery of Amaras. We have attempts from 1946 and 1947, and also maybe to establish a church in Stepanakert. As you know, it was closed down in 1923. But for different reasons, none of these initiatives took off. There was no return of the diocese, and no church was opened at the time. In 1947, actually, we have an incident when Georg, without actually coordinating his activities with the government leaders, he sends a married priest, Hagop Mangasaryan, to Amaras. But once he reaches there, he cannot start any activities because the local authorities tell him that they do not have any orders to reopen the church. And we presume that priest Hagop basically returned back to Soviet Armenia, where he had been sent from. By 1953, Stalin dies. In 1954, Georg VI dies, both because of old age. And in 1955, Vazgen I, a diasporan Armenian, actually is elected as the new head of the Armenian church. He would stay on the throne for almost 40 years, becoming a very important personality in 20th century Armenian history. And his first few years, as we see, were a period of very active relationship re-emerging between Soviet Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh. It was the Khrushchev era, the Stalinization, slightly less oppressive atmosphere, and cultural links to some extent revived. And in this period, Catholicos Vazgen also took a number of bold initiatives, and I want to talk about that. For example, we know that when the Karabakh authorities wanted to spread the use of the Armenian language, in Karabakh, they needed Armenian language typewriters, and Vazgen was involved in that, not necessarily undercover, but unpublicized efforts in order to get those 50 typewriters and send them to Karabakh so that people can start using those typewriters in their work. We now know from declassified documents that through spies planted around him, the Soviet authorities were aware that Vazgen also had what we call irredentist designs, that he had seen that the Soviets actually had wronged the Armenian people by actually leaving Nakhichevan and Karabakh within Soviet Azerbaijan and Akhalkalaki within Soviet Georgia. And we will see that, in those years, he actually tried to push that agenda as well. Soon after his election, he was allowed to travel abroad. He was the first head of the Armenian Church allowed to travel abroad since Sovietization, and he visited a number of Middle Eastern and European countries. Before his departure, he actually wanted to meet the Soviet Prime Minister, Nikolai Bulganin, and actually he presented a draft letter which he wanted to submit to Bulganin. That letter was handed over to the Soviet Armenian authorities, and as Vazgen was abroad, that letter was studied. And when actually Vazgen returned from his trip, before actually returning to Yerevan, he landed in Moscow, and actually in Moscow met with Bulganin and handed over that petition, which included a number of requests. This was not the first, because Georg VI had met Stalin, but in a way, this was also a very significant meeting. Githagalik was handed two letters. The first one basically on issues related to the Armenian Church. Among those requests was a request to reopen the monastery of Gandzasar. Many of those requests, well, all of those requests were actually approved by Stalin, but actually not all of them were carried out. So Gandzasar was not reopened, but many of the other things did actually happen, including reopening of many churches inside Soviet Armenia. The second one was a very personal initiative. Vazgen drafted the letter without consulting with the Soviet Armenian government and handed over to Bulgarin, requesting that Karabakh, Nakhichevan, and Akhalkalaki, or any part of them, be unified with Armenia, because many Armenians want to repatriate and there is not enough land for those repatriates to come, etc. That was the argument. He was politely told that he should not pursue these kind of irredentist claims. But as far as opening places of worship, he was given some hope. And if we look at his sermons, statements, etc., for the rest of 1956, he made, semi-open kind of hints that he was expecting these things to happen. The locum tenens of the Diocese of Azerbaijan and Turkestan from Baku, Father Dirar Mardigyan, a young priest, actually visited Karabakh on the 24th of October 1956. There is an official statement. He held a service at a newly opened church there in the town of Mardagerd, and he also visited the monasteries of Amaras and Gandzasar, which were of course closed at the time. And this is very interesting that there was a functioning church in Mardagerd for a few years, at least in the 1950s. I will dig more into this story, and this idea that there were no functioning Armenian churches in Nagorno-Karabakh between 1982 and 1989 are not 100% correct. They are 95% correct or 98% correct, but there was this one exception of the church, and I don't know when it was reopened, most probably in the early 50s. Maybe sometime around 54 and 55, I'm not sure. And probably it was formally closed down in 1964. I still don't know when it stopped functioning as well. It may have stopped functioning because being formally closed as well. But this is an issue that we should actually pursue further. In 1957, the following year, Vazgen actually made a trip to his flock in Azerbaijan. He visited Baku, Kirovabad. Of course, we have churches in Baku and Kirovabad, but he also visited Nagorno-Karabakh, where there were where was only that Mardagerd church, which he did not visit, but he spent almost like 48 hours, extended over 3 days, in Nagorno-Karabakh. He was in Stepanakert, he was in Shushi, he visited the monasteries of Amaras and Gandzasar. We know that he was extremely unhappy with the state of the churches in Shushi, and to a lesser extent with Gandzasar in what he sold, and he basically asked the people there to at least renovate them, etc. This idea that when he was in one of the churches in Shushi, there was a cow wandering around, etc., is very much written in his private correspondence with Soviet Armenian leaders. This is an official photo released at the time when he's in Stepanakert meeting, of course, the school children in one of his meetings with the local population. He received a polite welcome, including by the representative of the Azerbaijani government. And during that time, he presented the list, largely the same names that he wanted to see reopened in Karabakh and also in Nakhichevan. And Gandzasar, Amaras, and the church in Stepanakert were on that list. But again, nothing came out. The following year, Vazgen wanted to pursue his agenda, this time directly with Nikita Khrushchev, both the reopening of the churches and also irredentism. But in this time, of course, he was refused an audience with Khrushchev. But the whole correspondence is very interesting. And one internal memo by a Moscow official dealing with religious affairs, he says, why no churches had been opened outside Soviet Armenia. That is, in Georgia, in Central Asia, and also in Azerbaijan, where there were Armenian communities. He says there are three reasons for that. One is the leaderships of the other republics were categorically opposed to having Armenian churches there. Most of the churches that Vazgen had suggested for reopening were not preserved well and had been turned into other use, and the government was not going to give a cent for their renovation. And according to Soviet legislation, local believers had to present appeals, and none of those local believers had actually presented such appeals. Probably most of them were afraid that if they do that, the political police will take note of that and actually make life hard for them in any way. By 1958, when he presented a report on his first 3 years of activities, Vazgen would still say, we hope that a number of new churches will be among the churches we suggested to Bulgaria 2 years ago in Georgia, Azerbaijan, the North Caucasus, and the Transcaspian republics. But yet again, nothing happened. And this wish remained a wish. In 1958 and 1959, he again pursued the issue of renovating and maintaining these closed churches. He again appealed to the Soviet Armenian government, suggesting that 3 sanctuaries in Azerbaijan, in Nakhichevan, and 5 churches and monasteries in Nagorno-Karabakh should be reopened. These included the Shushi Cathedral, that is the Gazanchetsotz, the monasteries of Gandzasar, Dadivang. Dadivang is, of course, outside Nagorno-Karabakh, Amaras, and Yeritsmangans. Yeritsmangans is in the region of Mardagir. It is a 17th century Armenian monastery. The 3 young men, the Yerek Manugner, mentioned are, of course, the biblical figures of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego mentioned in the book of Daniel. From 1960s, of course, the activities of the church declined. Probably we don't have much published archival documents from this area, and I don't know if in the future new things will come up. There was a lot of activism in Karabakh for unification with Armenia, but we don't have any evidence from the documents published thus far that in any way the Armenian Church or His Holiness Vazgen I was involved in this events. Things got even worse in 1969 when Haydar Aliyev became the Communist Party leader, and the person you see in his laps is Ilham Aliyev, you know, many years ago. And actually, the Azerbaijan authorities suppressed these movements in the 1970s, and probably there was no hope at all that there will be any permission to reopen the churches. We know from the writings of the leader of the Armenian Ramgavar party, Parnak Tovmasyan, that when he was visiting Vazgen in 1977, Tovmasyan writes in his diaries that Vazgen told him that Armenia should be careful when raising the issue of Nagorno-Karabakh, for Azerbaijan was stronger than Armenia and had in Haydar Aliyev an intelligent and influential leader. This is, of course, from what is written in Tovmasyan's memoirs. In 1987, and this is now the Gorbachev era, here we have the beginnings of a new Karabakh movement, and Vazgen was on a visit to North America. And one of the journalists actually asked him, where does he stand about these new rumors coming out that there was activism? And he was still very evasive. He told, and I'm quoting from the newspaper Aspares here, that these issues were political, outside the limits of our activities. And he also downplayed the significance of this activism, saying that there is no such movement calling for unification. There are groupings and intellectuals who have issued such requests before. This is not the first. We're talking about November 1987. 2 or 3 months later, of course, it's the beginning of the Karabakh movement, with that decision by the regional Soviet of Nagorno-Karabakh asking the Soviet authorities to leave Azerbaijan and join Armenia. And it is only because of this movement that finally became possible for Vazgen to start thinking about reopening the church. But now, of course, he had to deal with the sad reality that as the years were passing by, many of these churches and monasteries were decaying. They were abandoned and nobody was taking care of them. The only thing that he could do in the 1980s was actually do some kind of partial reconstruction of the Gaziantep Cathedral, where experts from Armenia went and worked on the building, which was decaying. That was probably the only thing that he managed to do. Even more so, and this is of course becoming very important these days, it is from the 1960s that this theory of the Albanian origins of the Azerbaijani people started taking root. The father of this idea is a historian called Zia Bunyatov. And of course, since then, he has had many, many disciples, and his official, and what he wrote has now become official policy and ideology in Azerbaijan. For Zia Bunyatov, Albania was a much more developed structure in the Middle Ages than what we can deduce originally from the Greco-Roman Armenian sources. And because, Artsakh and Udik was part of medieval Albania after 387, for Zia Bunyatov, they had been part of medieval Albania since times immemorial. Azerbaijanis, the Albanians are the ancestors of the modern day Azerbaijanis. So basically, the territory of Artsakh and Udik and Nagorno-Karabakh belong to Azerbaijan. And basically, if there are Armenians there, they are either former Albanians which have been forcibly Armenianized by the Armenians, or they are newcomers who came to the area after the Russian annexation in the 19th century. According to Bunyatov and his schools, the latecomer Armenians suppressed the Albanian church, including the Catholicos State in 1815. They say that they bribed the Russian authorities to have it abolished. They translated Albanian literature into Armenian and then destroyed the originals. So many of the books written in these parts of the region, which have come down to Armenian, according to the Azerbaijanis, were originally written in Albanian. The Albanian original has been lost, and we have only the Armenian translation. There is no independent source ever to confirm this. But according to them, although the Albanians borrowed the Armenian language, and they have to accept this, they kept their distinct ethnic characteristics for a long, long time, and today the Azerbaijanis are their continuation. So everything that is Christian before the 19th century for the Azerbaijanis in Nagorno-Karabakh is basically Albanian. And Armenians have no claim over that because they are latecomers, and the Azerbaijanis are the true heirs of Albanians. Now, based on this theory, in 1968, the Soviet Azerbaijani government published a list of the Albanian monuments in Nagorno-Karabakh, even in Nakhichevan, which is even farther away and outside Udik or Artsakh, and all of these were classified as Albanian. And in 1988, this is under Gorbachev, and already when the Armenians had become more active, this was reconfirmed. And of course, in the past few weeks, it has been reconfirmed again that all these things are sorry. Albanian. Well, it didn't stop here. Bunyatov's disciples started saying that even what is now the territory of Soviet and now independent Armenia was also part of Albania. And so technically up until you go to the Euphrates River, and usually the Armenians consider the Euphrates River to be the western edge of their territory, everything there is Albanian, including a couple of years back when some Azerbaijanis had gone to the island of Akhtamar and said that the Holy Cross Church built in the 10th century, when we no longer have any Albanians recorded in history, that they had actually built the Holy Cross Church in Akhtamar as well. Now, outside Azerbaijan, nobody takes these things seriously, but Azerbaijan having cash and Western universities being starved of cash, don't be too comfortable with this in the coming years. Sorry that we have to also engage in some kind of self-criticism. Some have even said that the Albanians were Turkic, but still this is so far a minority. Because if we say now this new idea that the Turks and Azerbaijanis are one nation in two states, but the Albanians were not Turkic. So how do you come to sort this problem out? That will also have to be figured out. And I'm sure the Azerbaijani historians will find a way out of this, at least for their own purposes. Now, let me just finish basically with what happened in the Soviet years. Gorbachev came in. He was much more open towards the religious, and of course it was possible for Armenian Christianity to start respreading in Karabakh. We had the church-loving Brotherhood of the Armenian Church, the Yekhpai Rutyun, which is of course an organization faithful to the Echmiadzin line, being the first to go there and preaching. They converted, if you can say, or some born-again Christians came out there, and they started collecting petitions to reopen churches in Karabakh. This was in parallel to the petitions that were being drafted for the unification of Karabakh to Soviet Armenia. They sent a delegation to Echmiadzin with a copy of their petitions that they had sent to Moscow. And at this stage, the Soviet Armenian government decided to help Echmiadzin and pushed again Moscow for the reopening of the churches. And finally, despite a lot of resistance from the Azerbaijanis who argued that these monasteries were Albanian, Moscow authorities dealing with religion sided with the Armenians, and finally they allowed in 1989 for a few churches to emerge. Vazgen sent Barke Mardirosyan, then a priest, now of course an archbishop, to Karabakh. He became the prelate. In October 1989, for the first of those churches, the one in Amaras, was officially reopened. Let me just finish with the rest. Of course, since then, of course, we have to talk about two periods. One is the collapse of the Soviet Union, when we had the independent Nagorno-Karabakh Republic emerging. The Nagorno-Karabakh Republic, of course, authorities work with the Armenian Church, and the Armenian Church has come to reestablish itself in Karabakh. It has reopened a number of churches, institutions. Religious education is now part of the official curriculum in Karabakh, just like the way it is in Armenia. When the Armenians started controlling areas outside the borders of Nagorno-Karabakh, places like Dadivank, for example, were revived as well. And of course, this was the situation up until the recent war. In recent war, of course, the territory under the control of the Armenian government has shrunk. Many of these churches, like Zizernavank and Vankasar, even Gchavank, which is within Nagorno-Karabakh, have now come under Azerbaijani control. There is a lot of concern about what will happen to these monuments, and there is some kind of international response to this. The Russians, at least in one particular case, that of Dadivank, intervened, and they make sure that Armenian priests, 6 of them, are still in Dadivank, even after the region went under Azerbaijani control. They have been promised that the Russian peacekeepers will also make sure that Armenians will be able to hold pilgrimages to Dadivank. The last I checked, this was today in Karabakh, and they said this is still holding. But it's also very interesting that a few days ago, the Azerbaijanis sent in an Udi priest, and Udis are a very, very small ethnic group. There are 10,000 Udis all across the world, only 10,000 of them, and 4,000 of them live in Azerbaijan. They claim themselves to be descendants of Albanians, and so they say that all these churches belong to them. And they say that there are in Nagorno-Karabakh 300 Udi Albanian churches. So if you divide 4,000 by 3, there is a church or a monastery for every 10 Udis in this world. So actually this person went to Dadivank. The local priest did not allow him to come in. Then finally, of course, they allowed him to say a prayer, because in the end, the Udis are Christian. And up until the Russian Revolution, they were members of the Armenian church, keeping their separate sub-ethnic identity. So this person lit a candle, we hear, had a couple of photos, and then of course these photos were later on distributed by the Azerbaijanis, but he left. What will become of this, of course, in the coming weeks and months and years, we don't know. And that's where I want to stop my lecture today. We can talk about the modern period more if there are questions, and if there are questions on the earlier part, I'll be gladly answering them as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ara, for that very informative lecture. Can you please unshare screen so that we yes, thanks again, Ara. So there are a number of questions, and I would like to start several comments about how informative the lecture was. But let me start with some of the questions here. First, a question about using the term Azeri and Azerbaijan. Avedis Ghazal is asking, can you elaborate on the Azeri term and the Tatar designation? When the use of Azeri, Azerbaijan started, Armenian sources I read always referred to them as Tatars. Thank you.
I think let's put the word Azeri aside, because I think it's more than something that we use, but it's not important for them. What we are talking here about are Turkic-speaking Muslims who live north of the Araks River in the Soviet Empire, then came under Russian rule. Majority of them are Shiites, but there is also a significant Sunni minority among them. In the Ottoman Empire, they were called Tatars, but I don't think they are descendants of the Mongols or the followers of Tamerlane. Most probably they are more related to the Turkmen tribes who started appearing in this area from the 11th century. And of course, among them are also previously non-Muslims which were converted from the local population. In any case, they had a very distinct cultural identity. The Russians called them Tatars, but in no way we have to think that they had any close relationship with the Tatars of the Volga, the more famous Tatars in the Russian Empire, or the Tatars of Crimea, where of course the link with the Mongols is more direct in the sense. Now, the term Azerbaijan had always been used for the area in northern Iran, where also Turkic-speaking people live. They speak the same dialects, mutually intelligible. When it started to be used for north of the river Araks, it may be earlier, but definitely in the early 20th century. And when the Russian Empire disintegrated and 3 republics came in, the Muslim Tatars, as they were called by the Russians, called their country Azerbaijan. If we look at initial Russian and Armenian language literature, for example, the country was called Azerbaijan, but the people were called Turks up until 1936, when the official term Azerbaijani was designated. I'm using the word Azerbaijani because ultimately, whatever they call themselves, the people who lived in Shushi or Nuki or whatever, or even in Yerevan, yeah, they are the ancestors of the modern day people who call them Azerbaijani. In that sense, I think that this answers the issue. So I'm using the word Azerbaijani retroactively when I'm talking about the Shiite Turkic-speaking Muslims of, let's say, Shushi and areas now in Azerbaijan, even in Eastern Armenia, where they used to live in insignificant numbers in the 19th century.
Thank you, Ara. Another question that came up, and sort of I was thinking along these lines as well. You talk about, there's 3 actors here that you refer to in different contexts: Soviet Armenia, Soviet Azerbaijan, and Moscow, right?
Yeah.
And at different points, you emphasized some kind of differences in terms of attitudes regarding the church in Nagorno-Karabakh between these agents. Can you give a more detailed overview of this in terms of throughout this period, instead of just focusing on the 1980s or early on? What was the official policy of Soviet Azerbaijan? How did that differ from the official policy of Moscow? And what did Armenia do, if you can summarize it in that sense?
Look, I'm not sure about the first generation of Bolsheviks, whether they were really dedicated anti-religious atheists. And probably at that stage, there shouldn't have been much difference between Armenian and Azerbaijani communists. But as communism became the official ideology, it also became an ideology that you have to subscribe to. But underneath official communism, many of the earlier ideologies survived and thrived, including nationalisms. I will tell a small story, which of course will open up, which is not related. When Armenia became an independent, was on the road to independence, and the first non-communist government was elected, it passed a law on religious freedoms. This was in 1991, and I was a student there. And on the day of when the third reading was going to be voted on, so the text was ready, Catholicos Vazgen was invited to the Supreme Soviet. President Levon Derbedosser was the chairman, of course, had been a teacher in the seminary for many, many years. So there was also a personal knowledge between the two. And as it was voted, Vazgen gave a speech. And he recalled a story, which I don't know if has ever been written down. He says, at one time, and this should have been in the 60s or 70s, probably in the 70s, the head of the Russian church sends a letter officially to Vazgen and asks him if the Armenian church can join the Russian Orthodox Church. Well, Vazgen says, I wanted to reject it, but I didn't know what to say. So I just took the letter, and he didn't give the name. I went to a very high-ranking Soviet Armenian Communist Party official and gave him the letter. And he read, and he turned to me and said, Vehapar, we resemble the Russians in many, many ways already. Let there be something in which we are different from the Russians. So essentially, there was nationalism in Armenia, and nationalism was developing in Azerbaijan. So as much as we say that these struggles are not religious, because Armenians and Azerbaijanis are of different faith, religions are becoming pillars of identity and are being used against one another. So I will be interested to see how the Armenian responses were to Muslim requests by Azerbaijanis to open up church, mosques, and other places of worship in Armenia. Nobody in Armenia has studied this, and I don't know if anybody is going to do it. But definitely here we see that the Azerbaijani and Georgian government think the less Armenian churches we have, the less problem with us. They're closed, so basically let's leave it like that. Let them stay closed. While in Armenia, as we see, a number of these churches were reopened in the 1950s, and those who are of my age, they know that you can go to at least churches in Armenia. There were 3 or 4 of them in Yerevan. Not everybody frequented, but when we were students, we went there, and nobody told us why you went there, etc. Probably it was the same thing in Azerbaijan. There were 12 or more functioning mosques across Azerbaijan at the time. I don't think there was one functioning mosque in Shushi. I haven't seen it in their list, but again, I'm only using secondary sources on this. So ultimately, these nationalisms pay, and Moscow is basically trying to play the arbiter, trying to keep the balance in order to keep the overall peace. And that's why your problem. Vazgen actually visited Azerbaijan, his flock in Baku, and at sometimes Kirovabad, 4 times, as far as I know, during his 40-year reign. But the only time he actually went to Karabakh was in 1957. Hopefully, the published version of this work, I will give all the details of those visits, which I've tracked them down, etc., from the official communiques that went out. So I think this is the overall way that I see it.
Thank you. A few more questions, and perhaps I'll take 3 more, and we can wrap it up. The first is, during the 1920s to 1988, where and how did our Armenian ancestors wed if priests were not there, the church, or travel somewhere to Armenia for a wedding? And let's address this question first, and then I'll move on to the
Well,
topic.
Armenia is a secular state. The only marriage that the government acknowledges is the civil marriage, which the Armenians call ZAKS. ZAKS is the name of the bureau. It's an acronym of where these things are registered. And basically, whether you want to have marriage in the church, it's up to you. So you can formally get married in a government office, and that's everything is legal. And actually, you cannot get married. But for example, if you accept the legitimacy of the children without that paper, you are considered to be a full family rights. That's even more detailed kind of thing.
Thank you.
In that's of course Soviet law.
Thank you. Stephen Sim asks, this is probably too obscure a question to be answered, but did so-called Tukhmanuk shrines remain active and popular during the Soviet period in NK and Armenia too, as an alternative to the closed churches?
I haven't studied that in particular. The Tukhmanuks were active in Armenia, that's for sure. A few years ago, a conference was held on them, and there's a publication, but I have to go back and see if they also covered Nagorno-Karabakh. That's something I promised to do before the published version of this work.
Thank you, Ara. I'm also getting questions on text message. If possible, so the question is, please ask if Kantasar was built by Armenians prior to it becoming the center of Arvan Catholicosate under the jurisdiction of the Church of Armenia, which may be the most correct term. At this time, the name of the churches may have been based on territory, not ethnicity.
Well, that's why in my lecture, and also probably the published version, I will use the word Arvank, because it's unclear. The Kantasar church was built in the 13th century, during the Mongol period, that's for sure. By then, we don't assume that there were any Albanians left. And probably Catholicosate of Arvank probably meant the region of Arvank at the time. At least this is what the rest of the world thinks if we take Azerbaijan out.
Thank you. And there's a question about what you see being the challenges of the Armenian church in Artsakh in the post, in the aftermath of the recent war, so if you can comment on that.
Well, this is not a question for a historian, but I think they will try to do what they have been trying to do in the past 30 years, in the smaller territory that, of course, Armenian life will continue. I don't think the presence of the Russian peacekeepers will hinder their activities, that is, religious activities in any way. It may even help them, we don't know. So far, the first month of a relationship has relatively been okay between the Russian peacekeepers and the local population. So we'll see. As regards whether Russians will come into efforts of trying to bring the two nations together, and in that case, maybe the idea of Dadivank will be extended. We don't know. And what the reaction of the Azerbaijanis will be, we don't know. Of course, I assume that everybody, including the Diocese of Artsakh, will try to make sure that the Armenian nature of those religious sanctuaries that came under Azerbaijani control in the recent war has to be preserved. I know I was told in a lecture, Rebon Kevorkian, a source to be trusted, said that they had met the new head of the UNESCO, he's a Frenchman, and essentially UNESCO will send a delegation. President Putin wants international bodies to get involved in his statements. So, but we don't know what, of course, the Azerbaijani government's position will be. I don't think it will be something on its own. Whether things go in a positive direction of reconciliation or war, well, based on today's speech by Aliyev, war is animus is more likely, but also it's very early and you may not know international pressure. If it materializes, it may force or encourage President Aliyev to take a different direction. I think it's too early yet to make long-term predictions. So both options are possible.
Thank you, Ara. We are receiving additional questions. Let me field another one. Let me see. The difference between present Albania and Azeri Albanians, can you address that question?
As far as we know, there's nothing in common, just coincidence. That's what we think, or that's what most of the authors. Maybe there are some exotic people who will try to find links, but essentially nothing. And of course, in Armenian, they are very distinguished. We use the word Albanatsi, Albania, for the Balkan Albanians, and we use Arvan, probably it was Alwan at the very early on, and Arvank, yeah, for what we were talking about in this lecture, the area and the population.
Another quick question, perhaps, on using repatriation as an argument. How common was this among the civilian and religious leadership of Soviet Armenia in terms of making the argument of irredentism from a repatriation perspective?
It was quite strong in the 1950s and early 60s. It then stopped. And it was used by also diaspora Armenian leaders like the Henshagians and the Ramgavars in their discussions with even Nikita Khrushchev. When they met, they used that. The Henshagian leader tells Khrushchev, unfortunately, that comment has not been published yet. It's ready. I don't know. It was delayed, but he says that it's too slow. More people want to repatriate rather than Soviet Armenia can absorb. But if you give Karabakh and Nakhichevan to Armenia, that will make it easier for Soviet Armenia to absorb repatriates. That was made up to the 1960s. I think when emigration from Armenia started in the 1960s and 70s, when most of the repatriates started leaving, probably it would not be a very convincing argument as it used to be in the late 1950s and very early 60s.
Thank you, Ara, for this very informative lecture. It is reflected in the comments. Everyone is very appreciative of the tremendous research and knowledge that you shared. Thank you very much.
Well, it's almost on and off 20 years of work that Khachik, that I've been interested in this topic of Armenia under the Soviets for many, many years. And I've been gradually collecting info like an ant does, and hopefully at some stage it will come out as a book. I don't know when. I'm not in a rush because I want to produce something which is good quality.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ara. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Mark, would you like to say anything?
Thank you, Ara, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I hope everybody enjoyed it. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Bye.